Brian Lehrer on WNYC. By the way, I can now tell you that we have two great guests for the Brian Lehrer Show live in the green space a week from tomorrow, Tuesday morning, September 19th, in our usual 10 a.m. slot. We have Anthony Appiah, who you may know as the ethicist in the New York Times Magazine. Do you read those great columns? He has also written books on ethics, on identity, on cosmopolitanism, and his new one about ideals. Anthony Appiah, and we can now confirm that the very first dreamer will join us. Maybe you've heard the story of the young South Korean-American classical piano player, Theresa Lee, who was going to be deported until Senator Dick Durbin stepped in and used her case to establish the idea that kids who were brought here illegally by their parents and then grew up American should be allowed to remain without fear of deportation. And that led eventually to President Obama's DACA order, which of course is front and center right now. And yes, Theresa Lee will perform on the Green Space piano as well as talk with us. So it should be a great Brian Lehrer Show, Green Space edition. Theresa Lee and Anthony Appiah, plus other guests still to be named. We have 100 tickets at $15 each, so the first 100 of you to reserve your seats will get in. Reserve those spots at wnyc.org/thegreenspace, wnyc.org/thegreenspace, to see us do the show live here at WNYC next Tuesday morning, September 19th. Now, tomorrow is New York primary day, and we'll talk about that later in the program. In case you don't know who to vote for, I didn't even know there were some races in your district, so we'll get to that. But as for now, Irma remains unpredictable. Here is Florida Senator Bill Nelson on Morning Joe this morning on Irma's unexpected twists and turns.
Mother Nature has a mind of her own. She was supposed to go up the West Coast, north of Fort Myers. She suddenly decided otherwise, came inland, and headed for between Orlando and Tampa. So at 1:30 in the morning, we were getting winds of 100 miles an hour, and it was howling then. Lo and behold, it is still howling now.
So it was going to go east, then it was going to go west, then it went a little more east. We'll talk about how the storm has impacted Florida so far, as well as Caribbean islands like the U.S. and British Virgin Islands and St. Martin and St. Bartholomew and Antigua, Barbuda, and Anguilla, where most of the death and destruction seems to have taken place in that region. We're getting a new report this morning that 10 people are reported to have died in Cuba, even though Cuba is also reported to have done a very good job, and famously they do, apparently, in these situations, protecting infrastructure. So 10 deaths is a lot for anybody. It's a lot for Cuba in particular after a storm like this. Here with me now to talk about relief and what comes next for the places ravaged by Hurricane Irma is Jeremy Konyndyk, former director of USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. He was there during the Obama administration second term and led the government's humanitarian response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa a few years ago, the earthquake in 2015, and many, many more global emergencies and disasters. He's now a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, where his research focuses on humanitarian response, USAID policy reform, and global outbreak preparedness. Jeremy Konyndyk, welcome to WNYC. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. It's my pleasure. Good to be here.
And listeners, anything you want to say or ask about how the storm has affected Florida or any place in the Caribbean, or the emergency response, and then eventually recovery efforts, give us a call, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. Let's start with Florida, obviously a state many people in our area have connections to. Millions of people have lost power. That might be the most widespread impact. And the storm raged yesterday on the Keys and Miami Beach and elsewhere in the Miami area, then the West Coast in cities like Tampa, Fort Myers, Naples. Now it's been downgraded to a tropical storm, but it's still hitting much of the state. I think Jacksonville is getting some impact that they didn't first expect. What are you seeing so far, and what else can you add about Florida?
Well, I think Florida is a great example of the importance of preparedness, and we've seen some things that they've gotten right and some things that are a little more worrisome. The early warning obviously worked very, very effectively. You know, we were starting to hear that this storm would hit Florida in a very serious way in the middle of last week, and it didn't reach Florida until Saturday into Sunday. And so when you have 3 or 4 days lead time on a major natural disaster, that enables a large preparedness effort, a large evacuation effort, enables people to get ready, get out of the way, and that is the biggest factor that saves lives in an event like this. When you can see it coming and get people out of harm's way, that saves the most lives. And thinking back to, say, the Philippines in 2013, that storm, Typhoon Haiyan, which made landfall in the Philippines at a Category 5, with a wind speed of about 195 miles an hour, so even stronger than the landfall that Irma made. That killed about 6,000 people, and it did that because despite the early warning, people were thinking wind, they weren't thinking water. They weren't thinking storm surge, and so they got into shelter, but they didn't move far away enough from the coast, and that's what did a lot of the damage. So I think in Florida, one of the things that's impressed me is how much all the public officials from the governor right on down have been talking storm surge and warning about the storm surge, and I think that sunk in for most people and was one of the factors in what looks to have been a pretty successful evacuation effort.
And even this morning, I've heard Florida officials say the winds may be dying down where you are, but the storm surge could be yet to come.
Yep, absolutely. You know, we measure the strength of these storms in terms of the wind. So the category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is based on wind speed, but that obscures a bit the fact that a lot of the damage, as we saw, in Houston a couple of weeks ago, a lot of the damage can be done by the water, either by the rains or the storm surge, or some combination of those two.
That's right, and they say one of the differences between Harvey and Irma is that they were both hurricanes, but Harvey was essentially a rain event, or at least that was the worst of it. The worst of Irma was supposed to be, other than the storm surge, which could yet follow if you're really near the coast, Irma was more a wind event.
It was more a wind event, but those wind events can turn into water events with the storm surge. And so it's important to keep your guard up for that, too.
Can you talk a little bit about evacuation versus ride it out? Inevitably, if people evacuated and then their house and town were destroyed, some people will be disgruntled that, they undertook the huge stress and cost of leaving, and they might feel like officials and the media are crying wolf during the next storm. But of course, if people stay or aren't properly warned about the dangers of the storm, and a storm brings death and destruction, that's a problem of a whole different sort. I think different localities have made a different calculation at different times. We saw sure, this was the biggest evacuation in Florida history. In Texas, they more told people to stay put.
And that's a judgment call in every event, and it depends a lot on what the expected local conditions are, where you're expecting, how you're expecting the storm to perform, and what kind of evacuation options are available. So from where I'm sitting, it's hard to second guess, and I wouldn't want to second guess the decisions that they make. All I would say is, as a public official, if I do judge that it's best to evacuate, what's going through my mind there is probably, if I'm wrong, I'd rather be wrong in the direction that leaves my constituents alive to be angry with me, rather than the alternative.
Last week, before the storm made it to Florida, it charged through the Caribbean, as we all know, and that's where some of the most devastated areas seem to be. U.S. and British Virgin Islands, the Dutch and French sides of Saint Martin, or Saint Martin, depending on which side you're on. Some other places, 95% of the buildings on Saint Martin, I think they said, were destroyed. Same thing with Barbuda. And at least 25 people in that area, the Greater Caribbean area, have died, and I think that's before the report we just got a little while ago about 10 in Cuba. And as the relief effort was getting going, another hurricane, Jose, put it all on hold in terms of the beginning of the recovery. So what are the first steps in a disaster recovery effort for places like that so devastated?
Yeah, that's the path of the storm to the Caribbean is kind of amazing. In fact, the fact that it was able to skirt almost all the major population centers, it made a brief landfall in Cuba, but in a lightly populated area. And as you said earlier, the government there has pretty good disaster management capability, so they were able to largely get people out of harm's way. So the damage in, say, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which were the areas I was most worried about because Haiti in particular is just so vulnerable to events like this, the damage there was considerably less than was initially feared because it did avoid a landfall. But about a year ago, Hurricane Matthew, which was another massive hurricane, did pass across Haiti and did do a huge amount of damage. And so when we were working on that response, there's sort of a hierarchy of how you prioritize. So the first thing you want to do is rescue, and a lot of the rescue will be done, in fact, by local communities. So if you think about the whole Cajun Navy story in Houston, people self-organizing to go and rescue and help their neighbors to supplement the services that are provided by the government, that's a pretty standard thing, and you see that in almost any emergency, whether it's an earthquake and people are digging their neighbors out of buildings before the heavy search and rescue teams arrive, or people people giving shelter to their neighbors, helping their neighbors get into boats in Houston. That sort of local community self-help is always a big factor, and then that will be supplemented by search and rescue that may be provided nationally, sometimes provided internationally if it's a really big event. But that only lasts for a few days. Within a couple days of a major event, the people who are going to be rescued have been rescued. And so then you move very quickly into trying to stabilize the population because people are often very, very vulnerable. They may be left without their homes. Their homes may be destroyed. Their livelihoods are destroyed. Their possessions may be gone. A lot of the local basic services will not be available. So the first things that you try to do are just at a very basic level, get people into some sort of viable, immediate, temporary shelter. Make sure they have access to food, water, and if need be, good medical services. And provide those initially just on an emergency basis, a very urgent, quick, light footprint sort of basis. Once people have been stabilized, and that's kind of in the first week or two, then you pivot very quickly to trying to restore some sort of longer-term shelter options, get basic services back up and running, restore the health system, get people out of these temporary shelters, because often people evacuate into schools, public buildings, and then that means you can't use those public buildings. So you don't want to keep your students out of school for 3 months because you have a bunch of displaced people who are now squatting in a school. So it's a process then of trying to restore some of the essential basic services, and then the phase after that focuses on rebuilding and restoration. At a broader scale, and particularly trying to get people's livelihoods and jobs back up and running. So that might, in the Philippines, for example, the area that was hit in 2013 by Super Typhoon Haiyan had a lot of palm plantations, and many of those were fully knocked over. So that destroys a lot of people's livelihoods, and it can't be turned around quickly because it takes several years to grow a palm tree to the point that it can produce again. So that tends to be a longer-term process.
Listeners, if you have any questions for my guest, you can call in now at 212-433-WNYC as we talk about preparedness a little bit, but also what comes next in terms of the recovery efforts, primarily for Hurricane Irma now, both in Florida and in the Caribbean. You can also relate this to what comes next with respect to Harvey. 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. My guest is Jeremy Konyndyk, who was former director of the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance for USAID. That's the United States Agency for International Development. in the Obama administration. Some people say USAID is the Office of Nation Building, and it's being way downgraded under President Trump, and we'll get to some of that too. But right now, let's take a phone call from Anna in Fort Collins, Colorado. Anna, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, good morning, Brian. How are you?
Okay, thank you.
We're actually from New York, but my husband is a visiting artist here. The reason that I'm calling is that I'm calling on behalf of a friend of mine, Heather, who is a U.S. citizen. She was in New York for a number of years, but she moved down to Tortola to work on sailing charters and married a man from Antigua, Kirk. They have a little 6-month-old boy, Luke, and when Irene hit, they lost their house. And the communication has been a little limited, but my understanding is that they were in the house when it came down. And Heather's husband, Kirk, has sustained a couple injuries. He has numbness in one arm and has a head injury. And the baby, who hasn't had, access to all of his needs over the past couple days, seems stable, but has been showing signs of illness. So they are currently in a shelter in Road Town on the island of Tortola, which is a British Virgin Islands.
This is a horrible story so far, and unfortunately, and I'll let you finish, but, this is the kind of thing that because communications have been so disrupted down there and the U.S. media is focusing on Florida, must be happening in some kind of similar way to so many people, and we're just not even hearing about it yet. So how can my guest help you, Anna? Help you help them?
Well, her issue is sort of twofold, and of course, you're right, it's not her alone, so it's a broader kind of thing. The first is how to get off of the island and back to the U.S. where she can have appropriate medical attention for her baby, because obviously the hospital in Road Town is pretty strapped. And then the second issue really is that because her husband's green card has not yet been approved, and they've been married for about 3 years, it looks like the family is going to have to be separated during this. He'll have to go back to Antigua. And Heather and Luke will come back to the United States without,
the
dad and husband, respectively. So.
And was this going to happen anyway, this immigration problem, without the storm? Like if they were just there visiting or on vacation?
Well, they live there.
They live there. I see.
I can't speak to their exact status, but I believe they're permanent residents.
Right, but you want but you want those who can, the two who can get into the United States or back in to do so for health purposes. I understand. Jeremy, can you help this family in any way?
Well, so my biggest recommendation would be to reach out immediately to the consular services of the State Department, because they have, and I would imagine they have an emergency hotline for something like this. I don't have it at my fingertips. But typically, when I was in government, after any sort of an event like this, the State Department would set up a hotline for emergency consular services, support to U.S. citizens who'd been affected by the event, and then they could provide help with medical evacuation, relocation, and things like that. And I'm sure they've done that again in this instance. I can try and look it up while we're talking here, perhaps. And then on the green card issue, I'm less sure because immigration is not a special area of mine, but I imagine that same hotline could help with that issue as well, at least with advising what's possible.
And Anna, we're going to take your contact information off the air if you want. So even if Jeremy can't look it up while we're still talking, we can get that to you in a few minutes. Okay?
Well, see, I actually spoke with the Consulate General. I woke him up in the middle of the night last night, and I have all the information. But the issue is that, of course, there are no guarantees. And he, of course, I believe, is in a position to grant a visa, but because he's about 1,500 miles away from Tortola, it's apparently not feasible for one reason or another. So I think my understanding is that their best option, short of a medevac, and then the people on the BVI's coordinating, who are doing the medevac, coordinating with the U.S. government for what's called humanitarian parole. I think their other best bet is to somehow be granted upon entry what's called humanitarian parole for the father.
And I'm going to have to leave it there and get some other people with their stories and questions on. But any last piece of advice for Anna, Jeremy, having heard that?
Not too much more than what I said. I think, as I said, I'm not as familiar with the ins and outs of how immigration is handled in this instance.
Anna, good luck to your friends down there, and let us know how it's going and anything else we can do. Patty in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. You also have family in the Caribbean that you're concerned about. Patty, thank you for calling.
Yes, my sister lives in St. Thomas on the east side, close to St. John, a direct hit. She texted me on Wednesday when the storm was coming, and about 11 she said, "It's here, it's on us." And they were afraid of she was afraid of her cats because they had run away. And then at 1:15, my last text from her was, "We're cowering in the bathroom, things have blown apart." And that's the last I've heard of her. And my question to your guest is there hasn't been a lot of coverage of St. Thomas and what's happening. I mean, I've seen a couple YouTubes, but is the entire island down in electricity?
I am so I'm not sure what the electric and phone status is on St. Thomas. It is pretty common that in an event like this, cell towers can be knocked over. And I did see some reporting, I don't recall which island it was, that the winds and some of those initial landfalls in the eastern Caribbean islands had been powerful enough to knock over cell service, or to knock over cell towers and take out cell service. So it's entirely possible that's what happened there.
So, which is to say, if Patty hasn't heard from her sister, do not assume the worst.
Right.
Right. That's right. So I mean, it could be as simple as a matter of a knocked over cell tower.
And it would be like Mass Island. I mean, like, has no one heard anything from St. Thomas? That's, I guess, what I'm saying. Because I have heard nothing.
You know, we'll try to get an answer on that. And you're right. I haven't seen much coverage of St. Thomas. No. And Jeremy, if you don't know, you don't know. Right. So I guess you don't know.
Most of the reporting that I've been seeing has focused on Barbuda and Anguilla and St. Martin. I haven't seen nearly as much on St. Thomas.
Patty, we'll see what we can learn for you if you want to give your contact information to our producer. And Michael on the Upper West Side, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Good.
Thank you for the show. I love the show. Real quickly, I've been reading in the Washington Post about a blogger in St. John, and it's just unbelievable. If you read what the blogger's been saying, giving daily updates, it's turned into sort of some kind of crazy dystopian, almost a movie thing. They talk about multiple ATMs being stolen off-site. They talk about gangs going around, people desperate for food, no sense of security or policing or government or anything. It seems like St. John, as they describe it very calmly, is just sort of falling apart.
And the Times
have you got a chance to
the Times had a long story this morning on St. Martin regarding violence and looting as people are desperate for food and other necessities. Some are just greedy and they're stealing electronics and going to people's homes and literally sticking them up in their damaged homes in helpless circumstances, but a lot of others are foraging for food and other necessities, and that's some of the looting. And the Times made it sound like they're literally running out of food on St. Martin, and now Michael's talking about St. John. How does one manage a situation like that?
Well, that's where St. John is a U.S. territory, I believe. So then it would fall under FEMA and the local authorities in St. John to organize the relief effort. responding in these far-flung islands can be pretty difficult, and there's often a lot of turbulence for the first few days. And so the pattern you tend to see after an event like this is 2 to 3 days of a lot of confusion and chaos as people get their bearings, as the logistics and the access to the areas are very difficult. You think how tough it is to get things into Florida right now, and that's a mainland territory. It's got road links to the rest of the country. Some of these far-flung areas, if the ports are damaged, if the airports are damaged, then it becomes very, very difficult. And the pattern that I saw in many of the events that I managed was you'd have a lot of confusion during that first, say, 3 to 5 days as the airports were restored, as the seaports were restored, as some of the roads were cleared. And that's when the relief effort then begins to really gear up. Because then the logistics are in place to enable a lot of distribution. But those initial days are pretty rough.
Before you go, let me just touch on the fate of your agency, the one that you used to work for in the Obama administration, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. This is, would it be a slur to say you were in the nation-building business and that this is being downgraded now by President Donald Trump? And I think about this, in relationship not only to the war zones, like he seems to want to go into Afghanistan in an amped-up way militarily, but not to try to work on the conditions on the ground that could be labeled nation building, that are supposed to build the long-term stability that lets any eventual victories or peace hold. In this instance, after Irma, I think USAID would typically have gone into at least some countries, whether they were only the politically sensitive ones or not, you could tell me, and try to help with redevelopment, again, for the sake of selfishly building up America's credibility in the world as the global leader. How do you see the work that you were doing, and how much the good parts of that are threatened under President Trump?
So I think there was a lot of nervousness initially because of some of the rhetoric that he came in with, and because of the first budget that he put out. So the budget proposal that he put out back in the spring proposed about 30% cuts to USAID and the foreign aid budget, and that would be absolutely debilitating. And notably, one of the accounts that they were proposing to cut was actually the disaster assistance account that funds the sort of activities that AID is doing now in response to Irma overseas. Fortunately, I think we've seen a few good, more positive, encouraging developments since then. One is that Congress has stood up and really defended the importance of what USAID does. And so the foreign aid budgets that Congress has been putting forward are a little lower than I'd like to see, but they're not the sort of catastrophic cuts that the president was proposing in his budget. Also notable, I think the selection of the administrator for USAID, a man named Mark Green, is an excellent choice. He is a very strong leader for the agency, very experienced in global development, a believer in global development and its importance, and a former member of Congress, so knows the political side of things as well. So the agency is I think, in reasonably good shape at this point, good leadership, and so far Congress has been protecting its budget. So that's positive. What I fear on the policy side, as you note, is there is this really heavy emphasis out of the Trump administration on using military tools, and what looks to be an inclination, at least, to disinvest in civilian tools. And that would be a huge mistake, and it would be a mistake that would repeat a lot of the mistakes that we saw in the Bush administration. I wrote a piece earlier this spring when some of these first proposals were coming out to really gut USAID and gut the State Department, while pumping up the military further, that's kind of where we were at the beginning of the Bush administration. You think about how we went into Iraq. The post-war reconstruction in Iraq was a military-led effort. It was a DOD-managed, DOD-supervised effort initially, and it didn't work. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but a key lesson, I think one of the right lessons from that, was that having the military run things that were really civilian functions doesn't work very well. And And for those civilian functions to work well, they need to be invested in, they need to be sustained. And so President Bush, to his credit, I think his great credit, recognized that and did begin turning that around, began investing in hiring more Foreign Service officers for USAID and the State Department, began pumping those budgets back up and restoring those agencies.
Which is to say, you're hopeful that President Trump will see the light and do the same thing?
I'm hopeful someone will. I think it might actually be Congress that protects that more so than the President Trump does. That's what we've seen so far. I think Congress, the leadership in Congress understands the importance of these functions and has so far been willing to defend them. And
we will have to leave it there with Jeremy Konyndyk, former director of the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance for USAID. He's now a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, where his research focuses on humanitarian response, USAID policy reform, and global outbreak preparedness. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.